Nathan Kessler boarded the first-class cabin of the Dallas to Tampa flight with the confidence of a man who belonged there. His tailored suit fit him like a second skin, the silver cufflinks glinting under the soft cabin lights. The scent of leather and expensive cologne hung in the air, mingling with the distant clink of champagne glasses. It was the sound of wealth, the sound of people who had already won at life. Nathan smiled to himself. This is my world. He slid into seat 3A by the window, adjusting his Rolex as he unlocked his phone. The flight was under 3 hours, not long enough to work, but plenty of time to enjoy the perks of first class. He signaled the flight attendant with a slight lift of his finger. Scotch. Need. The attendant nodded smoothly, disappearing down the aisle. Nathan's gaze drifted across the cabin, sizing up the other passengers. Businessmen scrolling through stock reports. Couples sipping champagne. Then his eyes caught on her. A blonde woman seated a few rows ahead, scrolling through her iPad. Her posture was poised, her demeanor calm, as if first class was nothing new to her. There was something familiar about her, but not enough to place. She's probably some reality star, Nathan muttered to the man seated beside him, a mild-looking traveler who already regretted his seating assignment. You know the type: big hair, designer bag, and no real substance. The man gave a polite, non-committal smile, keeping his eyes on the in-flight magazine. Nathan wasn't done. He glanced toward the woman again. She hadn't reacted. That didn't sit well with him. People like her, beautiful and privileged, were supposed to care what men like him thought. The flight attendant returned with his drink. Nathan took a slow sip, feeling the burn of the scotch in his throat. He watched the blonde woman as she handed her empty glass to the flight attendant with a quiet thank you and a small smile. Nathan's eyes narrowed. That kind of composed ease, it irritated him. He leaned toward his seatmate. She probably married rich, Nathan said, just loud enough for her to hear. That's usually how these stories go. This time, the blonde's hand stilled briefly on her iPad. No glance, no reaction, just a subtle stillness. Nathan smirked, thinking he'd finally gotten under her skin. But he had no idea just how wrong he was. Nathan took another slow sip of his scotch, letting the burn settle in his chest as he watched her. The blonde woman remained fixed on her iPad, seemingly unfazed by his remarks. That annoyed him. Most people, especially women, would have at least thrown him a glance, some acknowledgement that they'd heard him. But not her. His ego stirred. He wasn't used to being ignored. Seriously, Nathan said to his seatmate, pitching his voice just enough to carry a few rows. You ever notice how some people walk around like they're the main character in life? He gestured toward the woman with his glass. Like the rest of us are just extras in their little movie. The man beside him stiffened but didn't answer. Across the aisle, a businessman glanced up from his newspaper, brow slightly raised. The flight attendant slowed her pace as she passed. People were listening now. Nathan felt the familiar thrill of attention. He smiled. But the blonde woman didn't even blink. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her gaze fixed on the screen in front of her. Nathan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on the armrest as he studied her. Maybe she was an actress. Or the wife of some hedge fund guy. Or maybe his personal favorite, a socialite clinging to the last shreds of her youth with the help of a plastic surgeon on speed dial. She looks familiar, he mused aloud. Some reality TV reject, probably. Or maybe the ex-wife of a senator. Nathan tilted his head, waiting for her reaction. Still nothing. That didn't sit right with him. The flight attendant returned with another round of drinks. Nathan smiled as the glass was placed in front of him. And whatever she's having too, he added with a smirk, nodding toward the blonde. The flight attendant's gaze didn't waver. She's fine, sir, she replied coolly, before walking away. Nathan's smile faltered. He wasn't used to this. He controlled conversations, he dictated the tone. But somehow, this woman was managing to pull him off balance without even saying a word. He glanced back at her, frustration curling at the edge of his thoughts. Who the hell was she? Why did she look so familiar? Then, for the briefest of moments, she turned her head slightly just enough for him to see the outline of her profile. Calm. Unbothered. Almost, amused. Nathan's jaw tightened. That look, it wasn't dismissive. It was knowing. And somehow, that was worse. The flight had settled into a quiet hum. Nathan's scotch sat untouched on the table as he continued to watch the blonde woman. He was obsessed now, his mind working overtime trying to figure her out. He hated that she'd gotten into his head without even trying. Finally, the seat belt sign flicked off, and the flight attendant reappeared. She approached the blonde woman with a quiet smile. Ms. Bondi, the attendant said softly, can I get you anything else? Nathan froze. Bondi. The name rang in his head like a gunshot. Pam Bondi. The realization hit him hard. He suddenly recalled the televised court cases, the high-profile press conferences, the political commentary. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General. The woman who had gone head-to-head with Fortune 500 companies and walked away victorious. The woman who had shaped state policy and faced down some of the most powerful political figures in the country. And Nathan had just spent the last 20 minutes mocking her. His mouth went dry. He glanced toward her again, but now with completely different eyes. Pam Bondi wasn't just another pretty blonde in first class. She was a political bulldog. A woman who had the power to ruin men like him with a single phone call. Nathan swallowed hard. He sat back in his seat, fingers tightening around his glass. Pam didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The flight attendant walked away, and Nathan let out a shaky breath. His mind raced. He needed to fix this. To smooth things over somehow. He leaned slightly toward her. I thought you looked familiar, he said, his voice strained with forced lightness. Didn't realize I was in the presence of Florida royalty. Pam's gaze flicked toward him for a brief second. Then she smiled. Not warmly, just a slight, almost imperceptible lift of her lips. She said nothing. Nathan's stomach twisted. This was worse than if she had snapped at him. Worse than if she had called him out in front of the whole cabin. Because her silence told him exactly what he was worth. Nathan's confidence evaporated. His pulse hammered in his ears as he sat back, trying to regain his composure. He forced himself to take a breath. Get it together. But he couldn't. His mind was stuck replaying the last 20 minutes, the smirking comments, the mocking tone. How many people had overheard him? How many of them had recognized Pam Bondi before he did? The businessman across the aisle had a faint smirk on his lips. The flight attendant's expression was still perfectly polite, but there was an absence of warmth that hadn't been there before. Nathan took a long sip of his scotch, but it did nothing to steady his nerves. I actually followed some of your cases, Nathan tried again, lowering his voice this time. You've had quite the career. Pam didn't even turn her head. The rejection stung. Nathan hated feeling small. It was a foreign sensation, one he wasn't equipped to handle. I guess it's not every day you end up sitting next to a former attorney general, he added. Pam's lips curled slightly, but still no words. Nathan's smile twisted. He glanced toward his seatmate. Guess I should have been more careful with my words, huh? His seatmate didn't look up from his book. Probably. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose. He was losing control of the situation, and worse, he knew everyone else could see it too. Pam set her iPad down, finally turning toward him. Her gaze was calm and direct. You were saying something about reality TV rejects. Pam's voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Nathan's throat tightened. I didn't mean anything by it. Pam smiled faintly. Of course not. She picked up her iPad again and resumed scrolling. Nathan's chest tightened. The balance of power had shifted entirely. And for the first time in a very long time, Nathan Kessler was not the one holding it. Nathan's pride was bleeding. His first instinct was to fight back, to reclaim control. But how? He leaned toward Pam again. Look, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Pam didn't look up. Nathan smiled tightly. Can I buy you a drink? Pam set down her iPad. Slowly, deliberately, she turned toward him. You already offered. Nathan's smile faltered. And I already declined. Nathan's chest tightened. He knew what was happening now. She was letting him drown. You don't have to be so cold about it, he said. Pam raised an eyebrow. Am I being cold? Nathan's jaw tightened. Maybe a little. Pam smiled slightly. I think you're confusing confidence with indifference. Nathan exhaled shakily. He was out of his depth. And for the first time, he had no idea how to fix it. Pam leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs smoothly. Sit back, Nathan, she said, her voice low and steady. Enjoy the flight. Nathan swallowed hard. He sat back, heart pounding. This was not the game he was used to playing. And somehow, he already knew he was going to lose. Nathan sat rigidly in his seat, the weight of Pam's words still hanging in the air. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white as they curled around his glass. He had never felt this off balance before. Not in a boardroom, not in a negotiation. He was Nathan Kessler, a man who controlled conversations, dictated outcomes. But here he was, sitting across from a woman who had dismantled him without even raising her voice. Pam Bondi had done nothing more than sit there, watching him unravel. And that's what made it so infuriating. He could handle confrontation, he thrived on it, but this quiet, effortless dominance left him unmoored. The flight attendant returned, pausing beside Nathan's seat. Another scotch, sir. Nathan opened his mouth to say yes but hesitated. He glanced at Pam, who hadn't even looked up from her iPad. Somehow, asking for another drink in front of her felt like admitting defeat. Just water, he said, his voice tight. The flight attendant nodded and moved away. Nathan could feel Pam's attention, even though her eyes were still on her screen. He forced himself to breathe, to steady the pounding of his pulse in his ears. Look, he said, leaning toward her again. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Pam's gaze remained fixed on the screen. I didn't mean anything by it, Nathan continued. It was just harmless conversation. Pam's eyes finally lifted to his. Calm. Measuring. Was it, she said. Nathan opened his mouth then closed it. Pam's expression softened, but not in a forgiving way. It was almost pitying. It's fascinating how quickly people dismiss the things they say as harmless. Nathan's throat tightened. I was just trying to make conversation. No, Pam said, her voice sharp and clear. You were testing me. Nathan's chest constricted. And now that you've lost, Pam added, you're trying to play it off as nothing. Nathan's jaw twitched. I'm not losing. Pam smiled faintly. Aren't you? The flight attendant returned with his water, setting it down with a quiet clink. Nathan didn't touch it. His hands were still curled into tight fists on the armrests. Pam picked up her iPad again. Relax, Nathan. It's just a flight. Nathan's gaze narrowed. It wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a game. And he was losing. Nathan's mind wouldn't settle. His pulse thudded heavily in his ears as he stared blankly at the seat in front of him. He couldn't stop thinking about Pam's words, the quiet authority in her tone, the way she'd stripped him bare without even trying. How the hell had it come to this? He'd spent his entire life crafting an image of control. He knew how to read a room, how to adjust his tone, how to manipulate conversations so that they always tilted in his favor. But this was different. Pam wasn't reacting the way most people did. She wasn't angry, she wasn't offended, she was simply dismissing him. Nathan rubbed his temple, feeling a headache creeping in. And then he realized why it bothered him so much. Pam Bondi wasn't the first person to make him feel this way. A memory surfaced sharp and unwelcome. Years ago, during his rise in the corporate world, there had been a woman named Rachel. A colleague. Intelligent, sharp, ambitious. Nathan had dismissed her, underestimated her, and in the end, Rachel had outmaneuvered him, landing the promotion he had been eyeing. It had been the first time Nathan had realized that charm and arrogance weren't enough to guarantee victory. He'd told himself it was a fluke, a rare misstep. But sitting here now, watching Pam Bondi effortlessly dismantle his ego, Nathan wondered if it had ever really been a misstep or if he had simply been blind to the fact that some people were playing a different game altogether. Pam's gaze lifted from her iPad briefly, meeting his. The look was brief, barely half a second, but Nathan felt it like a punch to the chest. He had been here before. And last time, he had lost. Nathan was still unraveling when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from his business partner. Meeting confirmed. 10 a.m. tomorrow. Be sharp, this deal could change everything. Nathan's heart kicked up a notch. The Tampa meeting. A high-stakes merger that could push his company into the next tax bracket. Billions on the table. His mind sharpened until the second message came through. Oh, and I heard Pam Bondi might be involved. Better not screw this one up. Nathan's blood ran cold. Pam Bondi. Of course. She wasn't just an observer in this game. She was a player. Nathan's throat tightened. If Pam had influence over the deal and if she had already made up her mind about him, this could spiral out of control quickly. He took a shaky breath. This was no longer about pride. This was about survival. Nathan leaned toward Pam, lowering his voice. So. Tampa, he said casually. What takes you there? Pam didn't look up from her iPad. Business. Mine too, Nathan said, forcing a smile. Maybe we're attending the same meeting. Pam finally set her iPad down and turned toward him. Her gaze was cool, assessing. Maybe, she said. Nathan's smile faltered. Pam leaned back. Then I suggest you stop talking and start listening, Mr. Kessler. Nathan's heart hammered painfully against his ribs. This wasn't just about first-class mind games anymore. This was about his career. His future. And somehow, Pam Bondi was holding all the cards. The plane began its descent. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing passengers to fasten their seat belts. Nathan sat rigidly, his mind racing. He had to fix this. He had to find a way to win Pam over, if not for his pride, then for the sake of the deal. Nathan turned toward her. Look. I was out of line earlier. Pam didn't react. I underestimated you, Nathan said. That was my mistake. Pam's gaze slid toward him. Yes, it was. Nathan swallowed. But I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong. Pam studied him for a moment. Then her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. You're learning, she said softly. Nathan felt a flicker of relief. Pam turned back toward her iPad. Now let's see if you can keep learning when it actually matters. Nathan's pulse quickened. She's testing me. And for the first time, Nathan realized he wanted to pass. The plane touched down smoothly on the Tampa runway. Nathan stood as the seat belt sign flicked off. Pam rose beside him, gathering her things with practiced ease. Nathan hesitated. Pamphlet. She turned toward him. Maybe I'll see you in that meeting tomorrow, Nathan said. Pam smiled faintly. Maybe. Nathan's hand tightened around the handle of his carry-on. And if I do, maybe you'll be impressed. Pam's smile widened slightly. We'll see. Nathan watched her walk down the aisle toward the exit. Calm. Controlled. Untouchable. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan didn't feel resentment. He felt respect. And maybe, just maybe, a flicker of hope. Nathan exhaled, squared his shoulders, and followed her into the terminal. He had lost the game on the plane. But tomorrow? Tomorrow was a new day. Nathan adjusted his tie as he entered the glass-walled conference room overlooking the Tampa skyline. His reflection stared back at him in the polished surface of the glass-sharp suit, confident posture, but his pulse hammered beneath the surface. He scanned the room quickly. A long mahogany table stretched down the center, lined with leather chairs. At the head of the table sat 3 board members, serious men in tailored suits. To Nathan's left was his business partner, Paul Marston, who offered him a tight nod. Across the table sat representatives from the rival firm, including Charles Eddings, a name Nathan had learned to hate over the years. But it wasn't Charles Eddings that made Nathan's stomach twist. It was Pam. She sat 3 seats down from Charles, dressed in a tailored navy suit. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek knot, and a slim tablet sat in front of her. Calm. Controlled. Unbothered. Nathan felt his confidence slip. She's involved. Of course she's involved. Charles's smirk widened as Nathan sat down. Kessler, he said smoothly. I hear you had an interesting flight. Nathan's jaw tightened. Let's stick to business. Pam's gaze flicked toward him, but her face remained neutral. The room settled into tense silence as the meeting began. Paul leaned toward Nathan and whispered, "We need this deal." Nathan took a breath. He had prepared for this. He had numbers, projections, and leverage. He just needed to stay focused. Pam's gaze sharpened. Nathan had the distinct feeling that the real negotiation wasn't with the board, it was with her. Mr. Kessler, one of the board members said, we've reviewed your proposal. The numbers are strong, but we have some concerns about the long-term scalability of your model. Nathan smiled faintly. I anticipated that, he said smoothly, sliding a file across the table. Page 3 addresses that directly. The board member skimmed the page, nodding slowly. Impressive. Nathan felt his confidence rebuilding until Charles spoke. Impressive, Charles echoed, but it's not enough. Nathan's gaze sharpened. Explain. Charles smiled. Your proposal assumes a linear growth rate. That's optimistic, considering market volatility. If we're going to commit to a long-term contract, we need assurance that your projections are realistic. Nathan opened his mouth, but Pam spoke first. I'd like to hear Mr. Kessler's response, Pam said, her voice smooth and even. Nathan's mouth went dry. Charles smiled faintly. Of course you would. Nathan exhaled sharply. This wasn't just business anymore, this was personal. And Pam Bondi had just handed him the stage. He forced his voice to steady. We've accounted for volatility by maintaining diversified assets across multiple sectors. The growth projection isn't based on assumptions, it's supported by market performance over the last 3 years. Pam's gaze didn't waver. And if the market shifts? Nathan smiled tightly. Then we adjust. Pam's lips curled slightly. Good answer. Charles's smile tightened. He wasn't pleased. Nathan's pulse steadied. He wasn't out yet. The meeting stretched on for another hour. Nathan handled the questions with practiced ease, staying focused despite the tension in the room. Pam didn't speak often, but when she did, her questions cut directly to the heart of the proposal. And then, near the end of the meeting, she asked the question Nathan had been dreading. You're proposing a 5-year contract, Pam said. How do you intend to maintain consistent performance over that period? Nathan's stomach tightened. He had expected this question, but not from her. Charles leaned forward. Yes, Kessler. How do you intend to guarantee that? Nathan hesitated for half a second too long. Pam's gaze sharpened. Nathan's mind scrambled for a response. He had data to support the projection, but Pam wasn't asking about the numbers. She was asking about him. I have a strategy for that, Nathan said, his voice smooth. Diversification across multiple sectors reduces risk. Pam's gaze didn't shift. And if that fails? She asked. Nathan's heart hammered. I adapt, Nathan said carefully. Pam's gaze held his for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly. I hope so. Nathan released a shaky breath as the meeting wrapped up. Charles stood, offering his hand to one of the board members. Nathan rose to shake hands with Paul. Pam stood last. She walked toward the door but paused beside Nathan. Nice recovery, she said. Nathan smiled faintly. Was that a test? Pam's eyes glinted. Of course it was. And? Pam leaned in slightly. You passed, barely. Nathan's breath hitched. See you at the next meeting, Mr. Kessler. Pam turned and walked away, heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Nathan watched her go. He wasn't sure if he had won. But he knew one thing, Pam Bondi wasn't done with him yet. Nathan loosened his tie as he stepped out onto the street. The Florida heat pressed against his skin. Paul stepped up beside him. That was close. Nathan smiled faintly. I had it under control. Paul gave him a look. Sure you did. Nathan's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Impressive. Pamphlet. Nathan smiled. He had no idea how Pam Bondi had gotten his number. But somehow, he wasn't surprised. Nathan had barely stepped into his office the next morning when his assistant appeared at the door. "Sir, there's a visitor here to see you." Nathan frowned. "Who?" Pam Bondi stepped into the room. Nathan straightened. "Ms. Bondi." Pam smiled faintly. "Mr. Kessler." Nathan gestured toward a chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Pam sat gracefully, crossing one leg over the other. "There's another deal on the table. One that requires creative handling." Nathan's gaze sharpened. "And you're offering it to me?" Pam's smile widened. "I'm offering you the chance to prove that yesterday wasn't a fluke." Nathan's heart raced. Pam leaned forward slightly. "Are you interested?" Nathan's smile sharpened. "You already know the answer to that." Pam's gaze darkened. "Good. Because this time, I won't make it easy." Nathan's smile widened. "I'd be disappointed if you did." Chapter 15, The Game Continues. Nathan watched Pam walk out of his office, her figure disappearing down the hallway. He sat back in his chair, a slow smile curling on his lips. Pam Bondi was not just another opponent. She was a master of the game. And Nathan had every intention of learning how to beat her. Or maybe, just maybe, learning how to keep up with her. Nathan leaned back in his chair after Pam left the office, but his mind was already calculating. Pam had given him a challenge, one that could either elevate him to the next level of power or sink him completely. His phone buzzed. A message from Paul. "Just got word Bondi's deal is linked to Eddings. This could get messy." Nathan's jaw tightened. Of course Charles Eddings was involved. He stood, buttoning his jacket. If Pam was pulling him into this, then it was more than just business. This was a game of influence and strategy. And Pam had just dealt the first card. Nathan's driver was waiting downstairs. He slid into the back seat, his phone already pressed to his ear. "Paul," he said as the car pulled away from the curb. "Get me everything on Bondi's deal. Background, players, any leverage we can find. I want to know who stands to gain and who stands to lose. And Eddings." Paul's voice crackled over the line. Nathan's gaze darkened. "Leave him to me." Nathan ended the call and stared out the window as the city blurred past. Pam Bondi didn't make casual moves. If she'd come to him with this deal, it meant one of two things. She either trusted him, or she was testing him. And Nathan Kessler didn't fail tests. Nathan entered the private meeting room in one of Tampa's most exclusive clubs. The lighting was low, the air heavy with cigar smoke and quiet conversation. Pam was already seated at the corner table. "You're late," she said without looking up. Nathan slid into the seat across from her. "You didn't give me much notice." Pam's lips curled. "You're resourceful." A waiter approached. Pam ordered a glass of white wine. Nathan requested a scotch. Pam set her tablet down on the table, turning it toward Nathan. A contract appeared on the screen, dense with legal language and financial terms. "This is the deal," Pam said. "A merger between two energy firms. Potential to reshape the market for the next decade." Nathan's eyes narrowed as he scanned the terms. "And why are you involved?" Pam's gaze sharpened. "Because I helped broker the initial negotiations. And because Charles Eddings wants to control the outcome." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Eddings again?" Pam leaned back in her chair. He's planning to undercut one of the firm's strip assets, consolidate power. If he succeeds, the fallout will affect the market for years. Nathan smiled faintly. And you want me to stop him? Pam's expression was cool. I want you to outplay him. Nathan's pulse quickened. Why me? Pam's gaze sharpened. Because you know how Eddings plays the game. And because I think you've finally learned when to stop talking and start listening. Nathan's smile darkened. You think so? Pam's eyes glinted. Prove me right. The waiter arrived with their drinks. Nathan took a slow sip of his scotch. And what happens if I win? Nathan asked. Pam smiled faintly. Then you'll have earned my trust. And if I lose? Pam's eyes darkened. Then you'll find out what it feels like to disappoint me. Nathan's breath hitched. Pam stood gracefully, gathering her things. I'll expect an answer by tomorrow morning, Pam said, her voice light but sharp. Nathan watched her walk away, his mind already working. Pam Bondi had just set the board. Now it was his turn to make a move. Nathan's mind was a machine as he walked into his office the next morning. He had stayed up all night analyzing the terms of the deal. Eddings was playing dirty hidden clauses, back-channel negotiations, and off-the-books incentives. Nathan smiled coldly. Amateur. Paul was already waiting for him. I've got the full breakdown, Paul said. Eddings is using a shell company to buy up shares under the radar. If he controls 51% by the end of the week, he'll own the board, Nathan finished. Paul hesitated. How are you planning to stop him? Nathan's smile sharpened. By making him think he's already won. Paul frowned. That's risky. Nathan picked up the phone. So is standing still. He dialed a number. A moment later, Pam's voice answered. Good morning, Mr. Kessler. Nathan's smile deepened. Let's talk strategy. Nathan and Pam met that evening in a private suite overlooking the bay. Pam wore a crisp black dress, her expression calm. Nathan slid a file across the table. This is how we play him, Nathan said. Pam's gaze sharpened as she opened the file. Eddings thinks he's secured enough shares to control the vote, Nathan continued. But I've arranged for a third-party investor to come in last minute and disrupt the balance. Pam's brow lifted. And how exactly did you secure this investor? Nathan's smile darkened. Let's just say I made a phone call. Pam's lips curled slightly. Interesting. Nathan leaned closer. By the time Eddings realizes what's happened, it'll be too late. Pam studied him for a moment. You sound confident. I'm not confident, Nathan said. I'm sure. Pam smiled faintly. Then let's see if you're right. The boardroom was packed the next morning. Eddings sat at the head of the table, his expression calm but his eyes predatory. Nathan took a seat across from him. Pam sat 2 chairs away, perfectly composed. The vote began. As expected, Eddings controlled a narrow majority. His smile widened. And then the third-party investor entered the room. Eddings's face darkened. He whispered something to his lawyer. His eyes flicked toward Nathan. Nathan smiled. Shall we continue? Nathan said smoothly. Eddings's jaw tightened. He had lost. Pam's gaze flicked toward Nathan, a spark of amusement in her eyes. The board vote shifted. The deal was secured. Nathan stood as the meeting ended. Eddings shot him a murderous look as he left the room. Pam walked over to Nathan, her eyes glinting. "Well played, Mr. Kessler." Nathan's smile sharpened. "Told you I could handle it." Pam's gaze lingered on him. "Perhaps you're finally learning." Nathan's hand brushed against hers briefly. "And if I am?" Pam's smile deepened. "Then maybe, this is just the beginning." Nathan's pulse quickened as Pam turned and walked toward the exit. "She's not done with me." And this time Nathan didn't want her to be. Nathan stood at the window of his office later that evening, whiskey glass in hand. The city lights flickered below. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Pam. "Drinks tomorrow night? Let's see if you're as good as you think you are." Nathan's smile widened. He picked up his phone and typed. "Only if you promise to play fair." Pam's reply was immediate. "Where's the fun in that?" Nathan's chest tightened. His gaze darkened. Pam Bondi wasn't just an opponent. She was a partner. And the game had only just begun. Nathan adjusted his cufflinks as he entered the rooftop bar overlooking the city. The evening air was cool, but the tension in his chest was burning hot. Pam was already seated at the edge of the terrace, her silhouette outlined against the city lights. A glass of white wine sat in front of her. Nathan slid into the seat across from her, signaling the waiter for a scotch. "You're late," Pam said without looking up. "I wanted to make an entrance." Pam's lips curled slightly. "Careful, Mr. Kessler." Confidence and arrogance often travel hand in hand. Nathan smiled faintly. "So which one am I tonight?" Pam's gaze lifted to his. "I'm still deciding." The waiter returned with Nathan's drink. He took a slow sip, watching her over the rim of his glass. "So what's next?" Nathan asked. Pam set her glass down. "We have unfinished business with Eddings." Nathan's smile sharpened. "I thought I already buried him." Pam's gaze darkened. "You wounded him." "He's not dead yet." Nathan's pulse quickened. He leaned forward slightly. "And what do you propose we do about that?" Pam's eyes glinted. "We finish the job." Nathan's smile widened. Nathan sat across from Eddings in a private boardroom. Eddings's face was a mask of calm, but Nathan could see the cracks beneath the surface. "You think this is over?" Eddings said coolly. Nathan smiled faintly. "Oh, it's already over." Pam stood at Nathan's side, her arms crossed. "You underestimated him, Charles." Eddings's gaze darkened. "You think you've won?" Pam's smile was razor sharp. "No. We know we've won." Nathan slid a file across the table. "Your assets have been frozen." "The third-party investor?" "Our contact." Eddings's jaw tightened. "You have two options," Nathan said. "Sell to us at market value, or lose everything when your stock collapses tomorrow morning." Eddings's eyes flashed with cold fury. "You set me up." Pam's smile sharpened. "You set yourself up." Nathan leaned forward. "Tick-tock, Charles." Eddings's hands curled into fists. His lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear. After a long, painful pause, Eddings signed the document. Nathan slid the file back toward him with a satisfied smile. "Pleasure doing business with you," Nathan said. Eddings's gaze burned with hatred as he stood and stormed out of the room. Nathan exhaled slowly. "And that is checkmate." Pam's smile widened. "I'm impressed, Nathan." Nathan's gaze lingered on her. "Good. I was hoping you would be." They left the building together, walking side by side through the cool night air. Pam's heels clicked softly against the pavement. "You handled yourself well today," Pam said. Nathan smiled faintly. "Only because you gave me the opening." Pam's gaze sharpened. "Don't underestimate yourself, Nathan. You saw the opportunity and took it? That's rare." Nathan stopped walking. Pam turned toward him, her expression calm but expectant. Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then he stepped toward her. Pam's eyes darkened. Nathan's hand brushed her arm. "So, what happens now?" Pam's lips curled. "That depends." "On what?" Pam's hand slid against his tie, adjusting it slightly. "On whether you're smart enough to know that this is only the beginning." Nathan's heart hammered. His hand slid around her waist, pulling her toward him. Pam didn't resist. Nathan's gaze flicked to her lips, then to her eyes. Pam smiled faintly. "Well." Nathan leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. And then he kissed her. Pam's hand curled against his chest as she kissed him back. Slow. Controlled. Dangerous. Nathan pulled back after a moment, his forehead resting against hers. Pam's lips curled. "Not bad." Nathan smiled. "I'm just getting started." Nathan sat in his office 2 days later, reviewing the finalized contracts. The deal was locked down. Eddings was out. The company was his. Pam entered the office without knocking. Nathan smiled as she closed the door behind her. "You look pleased with yourself," Pam said. Nathan leaned back in his chair. "I should be." Pam approached his desk and dropped a file in front of him. Nathan's gaze narrowed. "What's this?" Pam's expression darkened. "Eddings isn't finished." Nathan sat up. "Explain." Pam's gaze sharpened. "He's backing another firm." Quietly. "If they acquire enough shares, they could undermine your position." Nathan's jaw tightened. "And when does this happen?" "Within 48 hours. Nathan's smile sharpened. "Then we have 48 hours to stop him." Pam's eyes glinted. "What's the plan?" Nathan stood and adjusted his jacket. "Follow my lead." Pam's smile widened. "Careful, Nathan. You might be starting to enjoy this." Nathan's gaze darkened. "Who says I'm not?" The conference room was quiet. Nathan sat across from Eddings's newest ally, a young, sharp executive with cold eyes. Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "You've made a mistake." The executive smiled faintly. "Have I?" Nathan slid a file across the table. "You should read that." The executive opened the file. His smile faded. "You've just signed a contract with a shell company owned by my firm," Nathan said. The executive's expression darkened. "That's impossible." Nathan's smile sharpened. "No. It's strategy." Pam's gaze flashed with amusement from across the table. Nathan stood as the executive signed the paperwork. Eddings had lost. For good this time. Pam stood beside Nathan as the board members left the room. Nathan turned toward her. "Satisfied?" Pam's eyes gleamed. "Almost." Nathan's hand brushed against hers. "What's left?" Pam's gaze darkened. "Oh, I'm sure we'll find something." Nathan smiled. "I'm counting on it." Pam's lips curled. Nathan's pulse quickened. He had started this game thinking he could control it. But now he wasn't sure who was leading anymore. And for the first time he didn't care. Nathan stood on the rooftop terrace that evening, a glass of scotch in hand. Pam leaned against the railing beside him, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "You've come a long way, Nathan," Pam said softly. Nathan's gaze slid toward her. "Because of you." Pam smiled faintly. "No. You were always capable of this." Nathan's hand brushed against hers. "So what happens now?" Pam's eyes darkened. "Now, we see how far we can go." Nathan smiled. "Together." Pam's lips curled. "If you can keep up." Nathan laughed softly. "Try me." Pam's gaze softened. Nathan leaned toward her. And as the city lights sparkled beneath them, Pam kissed him again, slow and dangerous. This time, Nathan knew exactly what he was getting into. And for the first time in his life he wasn't afraid of losing. Because this time, he wasn't playing alone.